This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 15th of June 2024. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday, the 15th of June. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the week's news and culture with Charles Hecker, political analyst and author of the upcoming book Zero Sum. Then the founder of independent publisher Foundry Editions joins us to tell us about his mission to bring Mediterranean authors to an ever-growing audience. And finally,
I'm an avid gardener. It's a big part of my relation with the world and with other people and with cultivating my spirit.
Nigerian-American artist and poet Precious Okoyeman speaks about her exhibit in Basel. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday. First, though, here's the news. World leaders are gathering in Switzerland today for a summit aimed at pressuring Russia to end its war in Ukraine. But the absence of powerful allies of Moscow, such as China, will blunt its potential impact. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Friday Russia would end the war in Ukraine only if Kyiv agreed to drop its NATO ambitions and hand over the entirety of 4 provinces claimed by Moscow, demands Kyiv swiftly rejected as tantamount to surrender. Pope Francis made an historic appearance at the Group of Seven summit on Friday to speak about the pros and cons of artificial intelligence, while G7 leaders also pledged to tackle what they said were harmful business practices by China. Their summit statement, released on Friday evening, stressed the G7 was not trying to harm China or thwart its economic development, but would continue to take actions to protect our businesses from unfair practices, to level the playing field and remedy ongoing harm. And in South Africa, the African National Congress and its largest rival, the white-led pro-business Democratic Alliance, agreed on Friday to work together in South Africa's new government of national unity, a step change after 30 years of ANC rule. The deal between two sharply antagonistic parties is the most momentous political shift in South Africa since Nelson Mandela led the ANC to victory in the 1994 election that marked the end of apartheid. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. I'm joined now in the studio by Charles Hecker, who's senior partner at Control Risks. He's also author of the upcoming book Zero Sum. Good morning to you, Charles.
Good morning, Georgina. It's a pleasure to be back in the studio.
Your book is coming out in November. We're all beyond excited. But this week has been a very booky week everywhere. Tell us what you're up to.
That's right. Last night I was at an absolutely glorious celebration of books. I was at the Pushkin House Book Prize Award ceremony. And it was a gala evening and a celebration of writing, of writers, and of readers, of course, also in the audience, and the annual prize, which is now, I believe, in its 12th year.
It's given for Russian literature? That's
right. So thank you for asking. The categories or the qualifications are: it is an English language book written in the previous year about Russia or the broader region, Russia and broadly speaking, sort of the former Soviet space. And the winner this year was Yelena Kostachenko, who wrote a book called I Love Russia, which may sound a bit strange. But Yelena Kostachenko is a reporter for Novaya Gazeta in Russia. She is a celebrated journalist and author. And the book, the title, of course, is ironic. And it is full of her reporting of what has come out of Russia since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. She gave it an incredibly moving and passionate acceptance speech, talking about the trauma of war and how it's reflected in her book. And an extremely warm reception from the audience, among a number of books, each of which the jury told us was a very, very worthy shortlist member.
And I believe it was a very lavish evening, lots of caviar and vodka and so on.
There were very, very, very tasty canapes served after the award, and I have to tell you that the vodka flowed fairly freely. for a Friday night in central London, and one did partake to reasonable measures since we're doing an early morning broadcast today. But yeah, there was a very, very large open bar.
Well, there was also a large open bar at the Women's Prize for Fiction, and for the first time, the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction in its inaugural year. 29 years the Women's Prize for Fiction has been going on. Kate Moss, who's been a frequent contributor to this programme, is the woman behind it, the sort of queen of books, everybody calls it. That's Moss with an E, not the model.
Right.
And really fantastic party, despite the weather. It always takes place in Bedford Gardens, in Bedford Square. But there were lots of tents, and it was just really great. And it's sponsored by Bailey's, so lots of Bailey's cocktails as well as kind of champagne and things. And I caught up with the chair of the judges of both the fiction and the non-fiction, and both winners. That went out on the Globalist, so you can listen back to that. That would for Friday morning. And then on Sunday, the winner of the Prize for Fiction, we've got a long Meet the Writers interview with her. So that was really good fun. But it's been such a week. I mean, the last weekend, it was the Jaipur Lit Fest in London. Again, lots of kind of wonderful kind of Indian lavish parties in these various residences in Mayfair and things. And then last night I was at the Buckingham Lit Fest interviewing Daisy Goodwin, who's written this wonderful book, Diva. Again, another interview that you can hear on Meet the Writers. It's all about Maria Callas. It's a really lovely book. And so, yeah, what a week, man.
I ran into part of the Jaipur Literary Festival at the British Library. I was doing a bit of research for my own book, and the JLF took over the entire sort of grand lobby of the British Library, and it was colourful, it was noisy, it was musical, it was just the building was packed out and just full of life and excitement and a celebration of, again, writers and books and readers. It was wonderful.
It was such fun. I interviewed Vikas Swaroop, who wrote Q&A, which was then made into the film Slumdog Millionaire. And in fact, again, somewhere in the midst of our archives, there's an interview I did with Vikas. But we've known each other for a long time. And he wrote that book when he was a diplomat here in London. And then he went on to be a diplomat in Canada. I think he was the High Commissioner in Canada. He was in Japan. He was in South Africa. And he tells this wonderful story about being on a plane in South Africa. And the guy sitting next to him, the white South African, says to him, so what do you do? And he goes, well, I'm the Indian Deputy High Commissioner. And he says, oh, right. And they have a little chat. And then the guy pulls out his book, and it's Vikas's book. And after a while, he sort of turns to Vikas and he says, well, you're Indian. Do you know this author? And Vikas said, yeah, I wrote it. And he went, yeah, come on. First you're the Deputy High Commissioner. Now you're the author of the book. And Vikas went, well, look at the picture. Look at the picture. And the guy looks at the picture and goes, no. As Vikas says, authors always look more glamorous on the covers of their book than they really are.
Yes, I'm looking forward to some very careful airbrushing when it comes to my own author's photograph. So I'm completely with that and behind it.
But listen, book festivals have been in the news this week, but for a really a not great reason. Tell us about this whole row over Bailey Gifford, which is now just snowballed into involving Barclays.
That's right. So we're going to go to the Times, which has a story that says Barclays pulls out of Download, Latitude, and Isle of Wight festivals. These are music festivals that Barclays had a chat with the promoters of the festivals. The promoters asked them to pull out, and Barclays is reconsidering all of its cultural sponsorship. This is, as you suggest, in the wake of what happened with the Bailey Gifford Prize, which was essentially sort of struck off sponsorship of Edinburgh and Cheltenham, if I'm not mistaken, and Hay.
And Wigtown. I mean, I think it sponsors 10 book festivals, which are now no longer...
And what these two particular incidents point to is a broader trend. And Barclays and Bailey Gifford are re-examining and being asked or forced to re-examine their sponsorship of cultural events because of their involvement in fossil fuels and in investing or supporting or providing banking services to companies that are involved in the conflict in Israel and Israel's conflict in Gaza. And so a few things are going on here that are the very thin edge of some very troubling trends. The first one, broadly speaking, is that if cultural programming no longer has access to state-backed funds, one of the easiest and most likely places to turn is the private sector. Private sector funding is always going to come from companies that have either an activity or a footprint or investments in activities or companies or parts of the world that someone will find objectionable. And holding these companies up to a litmus test is quite a slippery slope, because one of the accusations that being leveled at fossil fuel-free books, forgive me if I get the name of the activists wrong, is that they themselves are being accused of a certain amount of hypocrisy, because while they want people to withdraw their involvement with fossil fuel companies or with Meta or with Alphabet, right, the corporate parent
Amazon.
of Google, the members of fossil free books are themselves using Gmail. Their books are sold on Amazon.com. And books, of course, are a resource-intensive industry. And while ebooks and audiobooks save trees, still a lot of books are made on paper. And that itself does a certain amount of environmental damage. And so the number one thing here is he without blame, please throw the first stone. So that's difficult. The other thing is that the lack of state-sponsored funds. The third thing is once you begin this trend of self-censorship on behalf of sponsors, where does this end? And then finally, the victims, if you to use that word perhaps in inverted commas, but the targets of the current ire of this sort of anti-Israel and anti-fossil fuel passion are cultural events. This isn't protesting against, let's say, animal testing. This isn't protesting against, sort of industrial development. This is protesting where the victim in all of this are book festivals and cultural events that ultimately will close, will become expensive, or will become a lot harder to put on as a result. And this sounds a little bit like shooting yourself in the foot if you are an author yourself who's protesting one of these investors.
I mean, it's very difficult. As several people have pointed out, this has resulted in not one bit of disinvestment from fossil fuels or indeed from Israel, but it has resulted in all book festivals, or at least 10 book festivals, and now some music festivals losing their funding. And of course, if one could rely on the government and the Arts Council, that would be wonderful. But what about government money? Look at BAE and so on. I mean, heavily involved in the arms industry. So it's very, very difficult.
Exactly right. I mean, and this comes on the heels of requests. This comes on the heels of requests for divestment from the United States and the university protests that we saw earlier in the year. And the truth of the matter is that this is all extremely difficult to unpick. And if you look in particular at Baillie Gifford had a tiny fraction of its investments in fossil fuels and was in fact itself a much bigger investment in renewable, sustainable, and green energy, and was one of the pioneers in that area. With all of these large corporations and asset managers and investment funds unpicking the way they work and asking them to remove certain things, it just doesn't work. And there is a certain naive approach in thinking that this is going to, as you've suggested, this is going to make any change whatsoever in the profile of these companies or in their impact on the ground.
Although, if one looks at history, so Barclays, for instance, who are now embroiled in this row, if you look at the struggle against apartheid, of course, Barclays was in the front line of that. People were saying, boycott Barclays, don't. And the sporting boycott, many boycott. Apartheid ended. But let's now look at South Africa, because as we've been talking about in our headlines, I mean, momentous election, and really the biggest switch since apartheid ended 30 years ago.
That's right. So we're in The Guardian now, and we're looking at a headline that says Cyril Ramaphosa re-elected as South Africa's president. The leader gets a second term after winning vote just hours after the ANC and the Democratic Alliance agreed a coalition deal. This is fairly seismic news coming out of South Africa. And by the way, this fits into the broader context. We have on this program and elsewhere been warning or forecasting, a quite tumultuous year as literally billions of people were going to the polls over the course of 2024. And we've seen seismic results in India. We're going to talk just now about South Africa. We've got the United States coming up. And then, of course, the bombshell out of France with snap elections called there. This is an incredibly tumultuous year. And, focusing on South Africa, the big news out of there was what happened to the vote share in the ANC that collapsed, The Guardian tells us, from 57.5% in 2019, so a clear majority there, to only 40.2% in polling this year. So after 30 years of government at the end of 1994, precisely 30 years, at the end of apartheid, the ANC is now being forced into coalition arrangements. It has struck a deal with the Democratic Alliance. This is historically a party that represented sort of the white minority in South Africa. The business community, for what that's worth, is welcoming this not only in South Africa but internationally. The business community and the investment community is sort of hoping that the injection of the Democratic Alliance into the coalition government will bring a certain amount of stability, particularly to the provision of energy in the national grid around South Africa. That was one of the most controversial topics in the election, one of the things that eroded the ANC's lead. I think that this particular coalition arrangement is as interesting for who it does include as for who it excludes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, we don't have the EFF, which is the very left-wing party. We don't have Conte Wesizwe in there. It is extremely interesting, and it's something I'm sure we'll be unpacking in the week ahead. But, the DA now received almost 22% of the vote. And Steenhuisen, what's his name? John Steenhuisen is saying, today we're a party of national government, and it will make a difference, I think, in terms of business and in terms of incoming funds to the country, investment.
That's right. I think that coalition governments, though, we're learning is sort of from the department of careful what you ask for. The ANC clearly is going to have to learn how to govern in a coalition. This is something that after 30 years of outright authority will probably not come very easily. This is what also is going to happen in India with Narendra Modi and the BJP having to learn what it means for the first time in his third term to share power. And that doesn't always go easily. It doesn't go smoothly. I think it's wise to anticipate in all of these countries a period of domestic and international elevated political risk and uncertainty as these governments become accustomed to each other, as they learn to share power. And because the Democratic Alliance will have the deputy prime minister position, it'll be interesting to see how assertive they are with their agenda for their first time in government.
Absolutely. Well, talking about sharing power, the leaders of the G7 have been meeting. And of course, Giorgia Meloni, fresh off the back of her election victory in the EU, in the European elections, very much the queen of this and also the hostess. But what's interesting is that their final statement came out and there was a bit of a row over abortion.
That's right. One of the things that we wait for at the end of meetings like the G7 or at the end of meetings like the G20 is we wait for the group communique, which is supposed to be an expression of global solidarity. Of course, the G7 is the world's leading economies, although China doesn't have a seat at the table, India doesn't have a seat at the table, etc. But in any case, this is a sort of the world's most developed economies getting together and trying to sort of set the tone for the coming year, again, in this turbulent year of elections. And we are accustomed to differences arising in the G7 on things like regional conflicts, including Ukraine or what's happening in Israel and Gaza, or on geopolitical issues. But what the New York Times tells us in a headline that says, a tense debate erupts at the G7, this time over abortion rights. We have a social issue very, very much at the center of this anticipated communique. And so you're right to say that Giorgia Meloni is very much at the center of this. First of all, she was the hostess of the meeting and is very much being celebrated on the global stage because of her increasingly firm grip on Italian politics. We are used to rapid turnover, almost annual turnover in Italian politics. And Giorgia Meloni is very tenaciously holding on to and developing her role in power in Italy. And so this was her moment very much on the global stage. But she wound up in conflict with the United States on the issue of abortion. There was a pro-abortion statement and pro-reproductive rights statement in the previous G7 communique that President Joe Biden wanted repeated very explicitly. And Giorgia Meloni, of course, who is herself and politically anti-abortion, although abortion is legal in Italy, she said, no, I do not want that level of explicit language in this communique. And moreover, she had a bit of a go at Joe Biden because she accused him of electioneering in this communique, because we know that abortion rights is one of the cudgels that the Democrats are going to hammer the Republicans with in November in the United States. What happened in the end, as always happens in these communiques, is there was an element of compromise. And so what they did was they borrowed some of the language from last year's G7 communique that talked about women's access to healthcare and reproductive freedom. And so there was a little bit of fudge thrown in. This will probably be enough for Biden and also enough for Meloni, who, while she is not seeking to overturn the legal right to abortion in Italy, she has to make sure that she's in line with her political affiliates back home.
Absolutely. Now, this G7 meeting took place just outside Bari in Italy. Fantastic kind of tourist resort and lovely, lovely town. And it's to the Mediterranean that we head next on another instalment of our occasional series exploring the world of independent bookshops and publishers. So Richard Village, who started Foundry Editions, it's an imprint that specialises in bringing writers from the Mediterranean languages to English-speaking audiences, joins me now. Richard, welcome to Monocle on Saturday. Now, you haven't always been a publisher. What's your background?
No, I haven't. Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here. No, I haven't always been a publisher. My background actually is in branding and brand strategy and graphic design. So publishing, I suppose you could say, has been my, hopefully, rather benign midlife crisis, and is what I'm dedicating myself to at the moment.
So what made you want to do it, and how did you prepare for it?
Well, I said midlife crisis involved actually me applying to go back to the University of East Anglia to do their master's program in literary translation. So I had very grandiose ideas that I was going to be a literary translator from either Italian or Spanish. And when I got there, I realized that the life of a translator may not necessarily be for me, because I don't know whether my attention span is long enough and whether being in a room with a text for 8 months is necessarily the best way that I could bring works that I think people in the English speaking world would really love to their attention. So I met independent publishers. I was lucky enough to meet the wonderful Jack Testard at Fitzcarraldo and Stefan Tobler at And Other Stories, who are great exponents of what we're trying to do with bringing more literature and translation to the UK market. And they were just incredibly encouraging and said, start a house, do it. It's what you should do. And so foolishly, because, I was in midlife crisis, I did. And here we are with our first books coming out this month.
Well, much, much better than buying a sports car or getting a hair transplant, I would suggest.
well, I think so.
So what is the ethos behind Foundry Editions?
Well, the ethos, first of all, the geographical scope, I think, is important, because my branding background really informed me that actually I had to have a hook, not only for readers, but also for, booksellers and people who might want to talk about or sell the books that I want to bring. So I was very keen on focusing on the Mediterranean, largely because I speak French, Spanish, and Italian. And so it kind of feels quite natural to me to at least have that as a starting point. The rest of the Mediterranean, admittedly, I'm learning about as I go. But also because, we are, as a country, mad about it, and millions of us go there. And culturally also, since Keats and the Warm South, we love the Mediterranean, and we are sort of intoxicated by it and by stories from it. So that was the starting point. And really, it's just what we're trying to do is bring fantastic stories that give a glimpse into the preoccupations and the lives and the beliefs and the passions and all of that of people who live around this amazing sea that we're all quite obsessed with.
And tell us about the initial books that you'll be releasing. There's 3 on the cards.
There are 3 on the cards. So the first one came out 2 weeks ago, and it's called Brandy Sour by a Cypriot author called Constantia Soteriou. And I'm utterly thrilled to have a Cypriot book as our first book because, Cypriot literature doesn't get an awful lot of publicity in the UK. And it's a wonderful, wonderful novella, short, to the point, and it's an exploration of Cyprus's terribly turbulent 20th century through the lens of this hotel called the Ledra Palace Hotel, which was built in the 50s to symbolize Cyprus kind of emerging from colonialism and emerging into the world. And Constantia takes characters who have either stayed at the hotel or have worked at the hotel, or ultimately who have been barricaded in the hotel because the hotel is situated completely on the Green Line, and it became the kind of ne plus ultra, the no passaran for the Greek forces in the Civil War, and she tells the story of Cyprus and through these ordinary people who live in a hotel. So it's a wonderful, very poignant read, and that came out 2 weeks ago. Our second book is an Italian book, which is translated as Your Little Matter by a woman called Maria Grazia Calandrone. And it's a really extraordinary tale about Maria Grazia discovering who she really is. So she was abandoned as a baby by her natural parents in the Villa Borghese in Rome, and her parents then took their own lives. Oh. And it's harrowing but amazing at the same time. And she investigates why this happened. So half of it is Maria Grazia is a poet. She's best known in Italy as a poet, and she reconstructs in this amazingly beautiful way the terrible life of her mother as essentially a peasant woman from the Abruzzo in the 60s. And this is the 60s. This is like not the 19th century. And how she was essentially traded in marriage for a few olive trees and was in an abusive marriage and ran away with a man, which made her a criminal in 1964. And so she couldn't get work. She couldn't get housing because she was breaking the law simply by leaving somebody who didn't love her and beat her. And then the second part of the book is Maria Grazia really investigating almost forensically the motivations as to why and how her parents would do what they did with her. And why would they leave Milan? Why would they make the journey to Rome? Why would they leave her in such a prominent place in the Villa Borghese to be discovered and then commit this terribly tragic act? And it's an amazing book. It's a really amazing book. And I can't recommend it strongly enough. And then number 3, we go to Spain. We whiz over the sea to Spain. And it's a book called Far by Rosa Rivas, who is a Barcelona-based writer. And she's called the Queen of Spanish Noir. And this is her sort of first venture away from actual detective fiction and noir. And it's this very, very atmospheric story of one of those enormous housing developments that were built during the construction boom in Spain that obviously stopped in 2008 when the crash happened. And so you're left with this community where some people have moved into what they thought was going to be utopia in the middle of nowhere, in the arid middle of Spain. And the rest of it's not built and obviously gets taken over by squatters. And it's essentially about the relationship between how these two fractured elements of Spanish society rub up against each other. And the two protagonists are from either side of the divide. And it's sort of a love story about how they navigate. So the 3 are very different in tone, but they really represent our ethos, if you like, in demonstrating different voices and different glimpses as to what it means to live around the Mediterranean in the 21st century.
Richard, thank you very much indeed, and good luck with it.
Thank you so much.
Richard Village of Foundry Editions. And if you'd like to buy any of those books, or indeed any book at all, do try and shop with an independent seller. Today marks the beginning of Independent Bookshop Week, which is a celebration of independent bookshops in the UK and Ireland. It highlights the vital role independent bookshops play in their communities, and it aims to encourage consumers to do their summer book buying with their local independent bookshop. Now, many bookshops have events today, signed editions, tote bags, other bookish treasures, and of course, an alluring array of curated reads. So drop in, buy a book or three, and keep indie bookshops thriving. And if you aren't able to physically visit a store, then just head to bookshop.org. Now, that's a great platform. It links indie bookshops. You shop there as if you were shopping on some other huge company that lots of people object to. And your book might take slightly longer to get to you, doesn't have those huge discounts. That does mean everybody's been paid fairly, and it's just a really great initiative. Now, from books to a more visual feast. While Art Basel brings the art world to the city for a week in June, year-round there are exhibitions and events at Basel's many top-class museums and galleries. Well, one such institution is the Fondation Bayele, which for the first time in its history has been transformed, alongside its surrounding park, into an experimental site of contemporary art. One of the artists involved is the Nigerian-American artist and poet Precious Okoyomon, who we caught up with to hear more about the contribution at a lush greenhouse filled with beautiful plants and butterflies, plus a sleeping animatronic bear named Beloved.
It's a greenhouse full of poisonous flowers, so everything in there can kill you. And it's a mysterious mix of things. You have the datura. When you eat it, it gives you visions for up to 5 days, morning glory. You have ricin, you have like actual like beautiful, really healing things like mugwort also. So it's like this kind of interchangeable like nightmare. And inside of the greenhouse lives my animatronic teddy bear Beloved, who wakes up from the nightmare every 10 minutes and lets out a blood-curdling scream. This is the scream of 3 amazing special people in my life: Sadia Hartman, Okwi, and Kelsey Liu. And my screams, all of us. It's like this kind of fugitive, black, like cry of the earth, forever trapped inside of a nightmare. I don't see nature as separate from humanity. I think that kind of is the shape of my praxis. There is no distinction for me. Maybe it's like my physics nerd self is just like everything is entangled and it's impossible to separate it. So I'm continuously on the path of like every space, the things I think about and create aren't separate from the world that we live in, and then those meld and play together. I'm an avid gardener. It's a big part of my relation with the world and with other people and with cultivating my spirit. And a lot of the things that I actively grow are invasive weeds. I have a garden in New York of just like invasive weeds, which are like a lot of seeds I've collected over the years and that like continuously like are planted, and a lot of things I forage. I think I like to like make spaces for things that have struggled to exist or are forgotten, meaning why I work with a lot of invasive plants or poisonous flowers or like strange flowers that grow on the side of the road. It's my relationship to the cultivating miracle. So Beloved is a piece I'm kind of revisiting and remaking again. First time she existed was last summer in Rome at San Andrea Scafus, which is a space Gavin Brown has with Gladstone. I turned the church into a poisonous garden, and Beloved was inside of there. And now she's here and found herself in this greenhouse. And the continuation of that lineage for me, that nightmare and how it travels, it's a very like, she's a very special object to me because first of all, she's designed off a teddy bear that I had when I was quite young, that I took everywhere, that I named Precious. It was crazy. I was addicted to my teddy bear, and it had the voice that said I love you. I blended it at Build-A-Bear workshop to be me and my mom's voice together saying I love you. So it's like I took it everywhere and I'd press it all the time. Like I was like, gotta leave this bear at home. And I designed Beloved off that teddy bear. And she's kind of in this vulnerable position as if she's in this place of rest, but the rest is from an assault or a waking of like a fear. She knows something. She's not like, it's not completely a body in rest. And she's based off the Toni Morrison Beloved character, which is a very special and haunted. Beloved is a haunting of an ancient spirit that lives inside of somebody that died, a bit too early, a baby that was killed by her mother to protect her from the dangers of the world. So she haunts. And what does it mean to be a ghost that is always already dead inside of your own nightmare? And here she finds herself in a garden where everything wants to kill you and you should probably be afraid.
The artist Precious Okoyeman there discussing their contribution to Fondation Beyella's Dance with Demons exhibition. And that's all for Monocle on Saturday. Thanks to our producer and studio engineer Mariella Bevan. Many thanks too to my guests Charles Hecker and Richard Village. Monocle on Saturday returns next weekend, and don't forget our market will be going on, our Swiss market going on here in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.